Opposition leader Tony Abbott has caused quite a stir with his comment in the United States this week that the federal government's defence cuts were irresponsible. Mr Abbott noted that as a proportion of our GDP, our military spending has fallen to the lowest level since 1938, and that indeed is a year heavy with meaning. The year of the Munich Agreement, the appeasement of Hitler and Nazi Germany, and the looming Second World War. But now Mr Abbott's comments, they follow concerns from the former senior US officials that Australia was cutting back at America's expense. The Prime Minister says that Mr Abbott's criticism before a foreign audience represents a new low for him. And the opposition's defence spokesman David Johnson has refused to commit to an increase in defence spending.
The black hole that we'll be confronting, the mine shaft we'll have to go down, we just can't tell how deep it's going to be. And that is a moot point that we'll have to look at once we get there, given it's such a variable in terms of the mismanagement of this government, of this portfolio.
Joining us now on the drum, Tom Switzer, a research associate at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney and a former Liberal advisor. Tom Switzer, welcome.
John.
Now, in your role as a former Liberal advisor, would you have advised Tony Abbott to have made these comments at the Heritage Foundation the other day or not?
Well, they weren't part of the scripted remarks that he made to the Heritage Foundation. The remarks were really in response to a question from a journalist that were really in response to remarks that Richard Armitage, a former Republican administration official, had made. So it was kind of hard for him to get out of it. But look, on the issue of the convention, this idea that politics ends at the water's edge, I think it's an old convention. And it goes back to a time when politicians travelled overseas. They did so when they were really uninformed about domestic offence. Winston Churchill famously said, I'll never criticise my government when I'm overseas, but I sure as hell will when I get home. I think those days are over, and it's largely because of the fast-paced nature of communications and this relentless 24/7 media environment. I mean, other prime ministers and opposition leaders have done it. This is not the first time a senior politician has done it. Paul Keating did it in 1995 when he was Prime Minister. He criticised John Howard and Kerry Packer for allegedly being in cahoots on a deal to end the cross-media ownership deal. So this is hardly a novel development, and I think it's been a bit blown out of proportion.
You mentioned Rich Armitage there, a neocon from way back, former Deputy Secretary of State in the first Bush administration, close to Australia, and has an interest in our defence posture. Do you get the sense that it's just guys like Rich Armitage that are concerned, or is this a more widespread concern in the US?
Well, I'm not plugged into the Washington scene on that specific issue, but Michelle Grattan, in her news report today in The Age, said it wasn't just Rich Armitage, but other senior Republicans and indeed Democratic administration officials. So these concerns have presumably been voiced in the course of the last few months since the government decided to cut back on defence. It wouldn't surprise me that Leon Panetta, the Defence Secretary, and his predecessor, Bill Gates, would have made these remarks in private. I don't think they've ever made them in public. So I think this is a bipartisan concern in Washington. This is what Abbott's really talking about. It's now down to, 1.56% of the total GNP, and it's a lot lower than the 2% benchmark for NATO countries.
But that comes after a decade of significant engagements, more than for Australia. And the US is cutting its defence spending drastically at the moment as well.
Absolutely. But in terms of the substance of what Tony Abbott was saying, he could have gone further, and indeed I'm surprised his defence minister here back home, or shadow defence spokesperson Johnson, hasn't made the point that the defence cutbacks by the Gillard government are strikingly at odds with the defence posture of the Defence White Paper 3 years ago. Yeah. It's remarkably different.
But the United States is sending troops to Darwin. Do we need a defence force anymore? The Americans are coming.
That's right. Well, look, I think to be fair to Tony Abbott on this question, he is giving bipartisan support to Julia Gillard on not just the war in Afghanistan, but indeed this enhanced military cooperation. And very few politicians in Canberra have raised any doubts about it. And I'm frankly surprised that no one on the left of the Labor Party even raises doubts about this, because after all, it's your very point. Why indulge in having the Americans based in Darwin? This would be the classical left-wing argument that you would have seen from the days of Tom Uren and Clyde Cameron back in the late 60s and early to mid-1970s. Those voices are now drowned out. It's quite remarkable that there has been such a remarkable sea change in the Australian political debate when it comes to the US alliance.
Tom, I take your point about the changing conventions about politicians and leaders who travel abroad commenting on what's going on back at home, but Wasn't, and I must say, I declare I'm not one of the people who has their undies in a bunch about these comments by Tony Abbott. I'm probably less excited about it all than some of the government figures that are saying it's an outrage. But isn't there an additional dimension here that in commenting on the defence portfolio and particularly Australia's state of military readiness, that there's an element of, come in, people, we're under-defended, to Tony Abbott's remarks. Isn't that really more the cause of outrage and dissatisfaction than simply the extent to which he was commenting on domestic affairs whilst abroad?
His remarks in the question and answer at Heritage in response to the questions about Rich Armitage's concerns about the defence spending being inadequate merely reflected what he's been saying before at home. That's a consistent position.
I understand that, but I think the convention about bipartisanship on defence matters generally connotes a sort of rule of thumb that you don't go overseas and start talking about how, as a nation, we are about to become chronically
I understand your point. I think if
under-defended.
Abbott went over there and gave a speech going out of his way to trash the Gillard government's defence spending, I think there'd be a genuine understanding. But he's sort of snookered, if you like, in the question and answer. Armitage is highly respected.
You can always refuse to comment. I mean,
Sure,
it's
but
not,
look,
it's not a usual Abbott technique, I accept.
But it's consistent with what he said in the past. I mean, I think the other issue to bear in mind is that I think Julia Gillard is trying to be a bit too clever by half by harping on this point that if Tony Abbott was sincere, why did he support the recent appropriations bill in the budget, which justify these defence cuts? Well, that's a bit cheeky because no opposition leader since 1975 has blocked supply, and Tony Abbott would never have done that. So I think she's being a bit too disingenuous when she
also, Tom,
criticises him.
just on the substance of his actual remarks as well. I mean, do you think that he's actually right, and it should be increased a lot? I mean, just for background, we spend 130 billion a year on welfare in Australia, and only 21 billion on the Defence Force, which is at European levels. But obviously we're not in Europe; we're in Asia, which is a bit more, more of a vulnerable region. With the decline of the United States, can we rely on the United States?
Well, I think that's a very good point, and the whole premise of the Defence White Paper, to which the opposition gave bipartisan support 3 years ago, was that the increase in military spending was driven by this decline of American unipolarity. This was spelt out by the then Defence Minister Joel Fitzgibbon, but also the emergence of India on the regional scene and the rise of China. So in that respect, it is at odds, and both parties are sending conflicting signals on that issue.
Well, Tom Switzer, many thanks indeed. Just in one word, do you think if this is an audition for Tony Abbott on the American stage, did he pass?
I think he passed it as much as Julia Gillard did early last year when she addressed Congress and met the President in
Thanks
Washington.
for joining us, Tom Switzer. And thanks to the panel as well, Annabelle Crabb, Adam Crichton, and in Melbourne, Greg Barnes. You can check out the website, abc.net.au/The Drum. Tomorrow night I'll be back with Chaz for Planet America. Hope to see you then.